Thank you, Leanne. And we can start this by thanking Leanne Ratzlaff and the currently absent but always helpful Max Landman, who is on a well-deserved break at the moment, for all the work that they do, and especially for this particular series that we've done for the Transformation Network's speaker series. This series has focused on community partnerships. So this is the last in our series this semester. Bringing us home are David Van Horn and Betsy Summers from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to share with us insights from 2 decades of continuous water quality monitoring in the Middle Rio Grande. We've been funding this work over the past year to support Dave and keep those instruments in the water. So we're really excited to see so many of you from outside the TN join us for this important conversation because we know that many of you have been helping to support this work over the years and are really invested in this river and are yourselves doing research in the river. And I'm excited to see Betsy, whom I've known since her time at UNM, and to see what she's been up to with the Army Corps. This is an example of just the kind of long-term collaborations that make the river, the investments that are going to make this work important moving forward and kind of save our river. So I'll turn it over now to the two of them, and hopefully we'll have some time for some interactions at the end. So thank you so much for all being here, and Dave and Betsy, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Melinda, for that introduction. We're really excited to be new members of the TN. And I think I'll just go ahead and jump right into things. We've got a lot to cover today. We tried to pack a lot into this. Our goal here today is really to introduce ourselves to this group and to let you know what we've been up to for the last 20 years. Yeah, to kind of give you an idea of what kind of work we do and what lessons we've learned from this work. So this is sort of a summary of pieces of the work that we've done over the last 2 decades. So I'm going to start off with some acknowledgments, a little bit of a history of the program, this water quality network. I'll talk to you about the data that we collect and the sites that we collect the data at. And then I'm going to launch into what I'm calling some lessons learned snapshots. And so I've got 3 examples of published work that we've published from this data set thus far. And I just kind of want to give you an overview of the kind of work that links back to the goals of the TN. And then Betsy is going to launch into work that she's been doing on whole stream metabolism in the river. And she published this work last year. And I'm going to finish up the talk with some really brand new analyses. I'm like kind of in the middle of these, but they're kind of exciting, and I thought they were a bit tantalizing, and so I wanted to share them with you. And I'm calling that part of the talk Changing Disturbance Regimes. So once again, I wanted to start off with acknowledgments, and the reason for that is we've been collecting data here for a very long time, and you can't do this sort of long-term data collection in isolation. This is a highly collaborative effort. Let me just hit pause. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. So this is a very collaborative effort. Lots of faculty, students, and postdocs from UNM have been involved in this effort, as well as individuals and a variety of agencies from throughout New Mexico, both federal, state, and local agencies. A special sort of call out here to 2 folks who got this going in the first place. Cynthia Beta was at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service when I first became a PhD student in 2005 or 4. And she and Cliff Dahm, my PhD advisor at the time, had a conversation about the need for water quality data to be collected in the Middle Rio Grande. And they really got this project up and running. And then all of the other folks on this slide have helped throughout the years. So once again, just an acknowledgement, this is a collaborative effort. So a little bit of history of our network. We began data collection in 2006 during the second year of my dissertation work. And we originally installed 4 sites in the Albuquerque Reach. And currently, we've expanded that to 7 sites, and these sites range from Buckman to Santa Acacia. And we have anywhere from 4 to 20 years of approximately 20 years of data, depending on the site. Funding for this effort has come from a variety of places. So it started with the Fish and Wildlife Service. The Army Corps of Engineers has been an absolute, essential partner in funding this over the last 2 decades. And then various other groups have stepped in when funding has dried up. So the Interstate Stream Commission gave us some funding for a couple of really important gap years, and now the TN is funding us for this year. Prior to us collecting this or starting this water quality network, there was very little known about continuous water quality in the Middle Rio Grande. And so this really is a unique and I think pretty important data set. So I'm talking about the data we collect. What are we actually collecting? We collect the big 5 water quality parameters. So that's temperature, specific conductance, dissolved oxygen, turbidity, and pH. And we collect these using these YSI instruments. We've, over the last 20 years, gone through 3 generations of these sondes, starting with these really ugly old instruments, the old 6920s, and now we're exclusively using the brand new, well, for the last decade, we've been using the EXO series instruments. And what we do is we install one of these casings, hopefully you can see my cursor there, at hard points in the river. And those are things like bridge pilings, any place where we have a hard structure in the river that will prevent the instrument from being washed away in a flood. And those casings are made out of stainless steel or aluminum. They're pretty robust, and they're robust because we get really big flood events, and there's some pretty intensive vandalism at some of the sites. And so we install those casings at these hard points, and then we go ahead and deploy one of these water quality instruments, and we service these about monthly, depending on flows, depending on conditions. During the summer, when flows are changing really rapidly, we'll service a little more frequently. During the winter, when flows are more stable and where it's harder to get to instruments, we'll take the servicing breaks will be a little bit longer. Something to note about this data is collecting this sort of data in the Middle Rio Grande is incredibly challenging. A little anecdote about this site that I'm showing you. This site is actually underneath the I-25 bridge. 2 months ago, I went out to service this site and I waded out to the instrument, and I thought I was going to be able to actually wade all the way to the instrument, but the instrument turned out to be in 2 or 3 meters of water. 3 weeks later, I went out to service the same instrument, and the instrument was in 10 inches of water and it was completely buried. And that is the kind of challenge that we're up against when we're collecting data in this system. The bed is highly mobile, and so it's constantly shifting. And so keeping these instruments wet is really quite tricky. So, and you'll see that in the data. Speaking of data, the data is available publicly via HydroShare, and right now we have the last 5 years of data available at this site. My goal is by the end of the summer to have all of our long-term historic data up on HydroShare as well. And if you ever have a data need, you're welcome to reach out, and I can get you what you need. So for this talk, we're going to focus on data from a single location, and the reason for that is at any one of these long-term locations, we now have about 3 million data points. And so trying to talk about more than just one site in this talk would be a little bit overwhelming, and I think it's probably going to feel a little overwhelming as is. So the site that we selected to talk about today is at in Bernalillo, about 20 miles north of Albuquerque, at the US Highway 550 bridge. And we've had the site equipped with one of these YSI sensors since 2007. And this site is actually a really interesting site in that it's a transition point for both river geomorphology and land use. So upstream of this site, the river is relatively incised, the channel is armored, the substrate is larger, and the gradient's a little bit higher. And downstream of this site, the gradient declines a little bit, the channel widens, and it becomes a sand bottom system. So it's this geomorphic breakpoint. And it's also a transition zone from non-urban to urban land use. So if you look at this photo on the left-hand side, this is the actual sampling location. Our instrument is in this stainless steel casing right here. It's affixed to this pylon that's part of this catwalk that AMAFCA built for their own water quality sampling. And so they've allowed us to co-locate here. And let's see, the rest of the talk is going to have a variety of components. And I'm going to introduce each section or each component with this figure. And what this figure shows you is all of the temperature data in the top panel and the specific conductance data in the bottom panel from 2007 to all the way through 2025. And each portion of the talk will focus on a subset of that data, which I'm going to indicate with a red box. And I'm doing this to highlight all of the ways we've been able to use bits and pieces of this data set over the years to answer these different research questions. So next, I'm going to jump into our first snapshot. And this is basically talking about data from this paper we published in 2015, which was titled Extreme Water Quality Degradation Following a Catastrophic Forest Fire. There's a little bit of a story about the data collection here. In 2011, in the summer of 2011, I took a day off work to go for a hike in the Jemez. And as I was driving up to the Jemez, I noticed this big smoke plume coming out of the top of the Jemez Mountains. And I turned on KUNM and I heard that the Las Conchas fire had started. Uh, and so and that it had burned about 50,000 acres in its first day following ignition. And so as I'm driving up to the Jemez, I drove across the Rio Grande on the Bernalillo 550 bridge, literally over one of our instruments, and I thought, oh my God, we might be about to capture the impacts of a massive forest fire on water quality in a major downstream river. And this was my first like experiential understanding of how important long-term data sets can be. You can't plan when an episodic event happens, like the Las Conchas fire. But if you're collecting this long-term data, you can sometimes capture these impacts. And this helps to justify the effort and the sort of pain associated with this data collection. I've been out to these sites literally hundreds of times, and that's pretty monotonous work, but it allows you to answer some of these really interesting questions. So this paper specifically looked at first, how does wildfire impact water quality? Um, do these effects propagate in the downstream direction? If so, what is the role of the monsoons in this propagation? And for this study, we used 3 years of pre-fire and 1 summer of during and post-fire data. And what I'm going to do here is just highlight some of very few findings from this paper. There's a lot more in the manuscript if you want to read it and dig into it, but I'm going to highlight the impacts of this forest fire on on dissolved oxygen. And if you look at this top left-hand panel, what you can see is we've got date on the x-axis and dissolved oxygen in milligrams per liter on the y-axis. And we've got some data in black, and that's all of our pre-fire data. That's the data that we collected in the summer of 2007 and the summer of 2008. And then in red, we've got the data that we collected during the summer of 2011, before and after the fire started. And what you can see is some massive changes in the dissolved oxygen concentrations in the river. We were able to document DO sags, I think 11 DO sags that entered either the hypoxic or anoxic levels of DO. And what's really interesting about this data is we're collecting this data about 70 kilometers downstream from the burn scar. So these impacts to the river propagated for a very long ways downstream. And then because we had this network in the Albuquerque Reach, we were able to follow that propagation down through Albuquerque. And so these 4 water quality traces are once again dissolved oxygen. It's following this dissolved oxygen sag. And the first drop that you see is the drop that's represented here at 550. And then we saw that same sag at Alameda, then at Rio Bravo, and then at I-25. And as you can see, the sag dissipated a little bit, probably due to reaeration, natural process. But what this tells us is not only did the fire effects make their way 70 kilometers downstream to the Bernalillo site, but they went another 50 kilometers downstream in the main stem itself. We were then able to link these impacts to monsoon precipitation events on the burn scar using NextRad data. Um, so we published, I don't remember, somewhere between 3 and 5 papers on the loss conscious fire. And as we were publishing those papers and thinking about forest fire and stream ecosystems, it started to raise this question in our mind, which was how many other streams in the Western US are also impacted by wildfire? Um, we were lucky to catch the impacts of the loss conscious fire because we had this water quality network already deployed. But following most fires, there is no deployed water quality network. So what we did was worked on this paper titled Wildfires Increasingly Impact Western U.S. Fluvial Networks. Um, and our goals here were to calculate, our research questions were to ask what percentage of streams in the Western US are fire impacted? How does this change by ecoregion? And then how do these impacts propagate? And in this paper, we used about 3 months of the data from this long-term data set. And really briefly, what we did in our analysis was we summed all of the stream length in every burn perimeter for every burn that has occurred in the last 30 years in the Western United States. And we first generated then a total stream length in the Western US that has been impacted by fire over the last 30 years. And that number is about 6%. And then we looked at how that fire impacted stream length has been changing over the last 30 years. And we found that approximately an additional 340 kilometers of stream length per year are being impacted by wildfire. Now, that's just within the burn scar. We also looked at this by ecoregion. There are some ecoregions where a very small percentage of the streams are being impacted by wildfire, like 1%. Other ecoregions have 12% impacted. There's a lot of between ecoregion variation. Um, so the next thing we did in this paper was we used our data from the Las Conchas fire to look at downstream propagation. And then we built a pretty simple model to estimate how far downstream these wildfire impacts propagate. And we came up with this kind of interesting and quite simple relationship that suggests that propagation impacts approximately the same length of stream as was inside the burn scar or the burn perimeter. So to say that a little more clearly, if you have a burn perimeter that includes about, say 300 kilometers of stream length, this model suggests that an additional 300 kilometers of stream length downstream will be impacted as well. And so this suggests that instead of 6% of the streams in the Western United States being impacted by fires over the last 30 years, it's probably closer to 13 or 15%. And that makes wildfires one of the largest impacts to stream ecosystems. Okay, the last snapshot. And once again, these are just three of the papers we've published from this work, and I just tried to pick three of the higher impact papers. But this last paper, this last snapshot, is titled Water Quality Impacts of Urban and Non-Urban Arid Land Runoff on the Rio Grande. And this was written by postdoc Peter Rieger, published in 2020. And here the research questions were, what are the differences in urban versus non-urban water quality signatures? What drives these differences? And uh, how do these differences impact management? And so for this paper, Peter used about 4 months of our continuous data set. And what he found was using the big five water quality parameters, we could really easily separate runoff events into urban versus non-urban events. And so the water quality for those two types of events are pretty distinct. And the ways in which they're distinct are one, urban events tend to have low DO, low specific conductance, and lower turbidity and high FDOM. We actually added FDOM to this analysis. Uh, And the non-urban events have high specific conductance, high turbidity, and low FDOM and low pH. And what's happening here is when precipitation hits an urban versus a non-urban watershed, very different things occur. So when a storm hits an non-urban landscape, it interacts, the water from the storm event interacts with the soil. It picks up salts and it mobilizes sediment. And so we see a pretty significant specific conductance pulse and a turbidity pulse. In contrast, when a storm event hits an urban area, the water hits impervious surfaces, it runs off without picking up salts. And so it causes a specific conductance sag. And it also causes a pretty significant dissolved oxygen sag, which is probably a combination of BOD as well as temperature issues. So those are three snapshots of things we've learned over the last 20 years using this data set. I'm now going to hand this off to Betsy, and she's going to talk about, sorry, my screen's frozen here. Um, she's going to talk about her work.
Hey, mic check. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, great, thanks. Good to see some familiar faces and some new ones adding to the growing family that are interested in the Rio Grande. Happy Earth Day. Thanks. Again, I'm Betsy Summers. For those who don't know me, I'm a hydraulic engineer currently in the water management section at the Corps. The work that I'm presenting is actually a chapter for my PhD, and it was funded by the Corps through the collaborative program and at the Albuquerque district, and it helped me complete the work and package it up for publication. So this research fits in with the long-term goal of the collaborative program to support the understanding of the endangered silvery minnow in the Rio Grande, and specifically my work is focusing on the basal food resources or primary production that this fish is known to feed on. Okay, so focusing on the 9 years that Dave has highlighted of this longer record, my research questions are, what are the drivers of GPP in the MRG? At what scales do these drivers operate? And how do drivers of GPP change seasonally? Next slide. Okay, here's just highlighting that this work was published last year in Limnology and Oceanography, and it's on the broad scale climate patterns combined with local flow and turbidity disturbance, how that structures the seasonality of gross primary production, or GPP. So first I'm going to introduce what whole stream metabolism is. For those not familiar, I'll give a quick background of the hydroclimate for those that are out of state, and then I'll dive deep into the paper, and this is where you buckle up and follow along, and then I'll present some additional work that I'm pursuing on hopefully publishing here in the next couple of years. Okay, so stream metabolism is comprised of the production and consumption of carbon and oxygen. We use the terms gross primary production, or GPP. I've already thrown those terms out. And this is basically the GPP is what's fixing the carbon, and it's producing the oxygen that's detected in the by the water quality sensors. Ecosystem restoration, or ER, is the consumption of carbon and oxygen, and this is carried out by organisms, including heterotrophs and primary producers. And these are ecosystem level processes that we are talking about here. And we're interested in metabolism because we can estimate it daily, And ultimately, we can generate a time series using the water quality data that Dave discussed earlier. And then more specifically, we can use these time series of GBP and ER to better understand ecosystem level responses to disturbances. Dave mentioned the fire, there's hydrology, there's land use change, and we can also use these variables to look at carbon budgets. So the Middle Rio Grande, next slide, has a hydroclimate where the flow is variable and it's driven by snowmelt runoff in the spring and the monsoons in the summer. These images on the top left just show how these hydrologic events happen at different time scales, or in other words, the duration of these elevated flows in the river differ between these two seasons. Additionally, we have the El Nino Southern Oscillation Phenomenon, or ENSO, and this typically influences our snowpack. El Nino years are associated with higher snowpack, and that's what this graph in the middle is pointing out with the arrows of 7 decades of spring flow in the Pecos River, and these elevated flows are driven by the El Nino years. We have erosive landscapes because of the sparse vegetation, and this results in high sediment transport loads, typically caused by the monsoon runoff in the summer. The figure in the bottom right just shows sediment being dumped from the Jemez River into the clear water of the Middle Rio Grande that is below Cochiti, and this confluence is actually above where our site is located. And finally, I mentioned Cochiti Dam. We have human modification that also includes levees and diversions. And okay, so our conceptual model is based on hypotheses that links climate forcings, physical disturbances, and ecosystem response. So the figure, starting at the top, we have the climate forcings of ENSO, and then the NAM is the North American monsoon. Our physical disturbances are discharge and turbidity, as these drivers act to scour or limit light for the primary producers, and our ecosystem response is GPP. And we separated these into spring and summer periods based on the hydrologic patterns of snowmelt and the monsoons that I've talked about. On the bottom, we have this time series of an idealized disturbance pattern for flow in blue and turbidity in the tan color. You can see there's a prolonged increase in discharge in spring from the snowmelt. And at that time, turbidity increases are minor. And then we shift in the summer to a flashy system with abrupt and higher increases in turbidity and to a lesser extent discharge. And I just also want to point out that each arrow represents a testable relationship between the predictor and the response variable, and these thicker arrows we hypothesize have a stronger effect compared to the thinner arrows. So I'll talk about how metabolism is modeled. We use a governing equation based on the mass balance of dissolved oxygen. And basically, the change in dissolved oxygen over time is driven by the biological components, which are GPP and ER, or the autotrophs and the heterotrophs, and driven physically by K in this equation, which is reaeration, and that's just the exchange of gas between the air and the water surfaces. So I use stream metabolizer. It's a package in R, and basically this package does, it actually models the dissolved oxygen signal based on relationships between these parameters in the equation with environmental data like light and water temperature. And then what you do in this with this model, this package, is compare it, the modeled dissolved oxygen signal with the measured dissolved oxygen signal that the water quality sensor picks up. And this figure just on the left just shows within 1 day the change in oxygen concentration, and this figure shows a good fit in the model DO and the observed DO. I'd like to highlight that in order to solve this equation, we need instantaneous or sub-daily dissolved oxygen data. And we ran this larger data set on UNM supercomputers. So we have a really long record of metabolism, that's GPP and ER, but we are just focusing on 9 years of GPP for this talk. All right. Historical climate information on ENSO was taken from NOAA. We used the Oceanic Nino Index, or the ONI, and that basically just references the 3-month running mean of the sea surface temperature anomalies for the December through February period. We developed a monsoon index using monthly mean prism precip data, and this was for the June through September of each year in our study. And
Yeah, water, please. Yeah.
hot mic. So the precip, if that's not a question, I'll just keep going, but speak up if it's. So the precip data, we looked at a drainage area that would impact the water quality sensor at our site. And so we basically just cut out the precip below Cochiti and anything above the water quality sensors. And these climate variables are continuous. It's a continuous index, and you can see in the plots here on the top left, sorry, on the top is the ONI, and where the blue and the positive would fall into this El Nino category, it would be presumably a higher snowpack versus the La Nina years. And so we got quite a spread. On the bottom figure is the monsoon index. Again, the positive is the wetter period, and negative is drier relative to this 0 y-axis, which is a 30-year mean. And now I'll jump into my analyses. Again, looking back at our conceptual model, our testable relationships are between climate index, physical disturbance, and the ecosystem process. So we looked at 2 time scales, annual and daily means, to match how these climate forcings appear to be imprinting on the system. We thought the annual scale could capture the influence of snowmelt on the spring GPP, whereas the abrupt influence of the summer monsoon is better captured at the daily scale. So again, annual scale analysis, we use means for each time period, the spring and summer, and we developed separate linear models for those times periods. The daily scale analysis used daily means for the hierarchical generalized additive models, or HGAMs. And we use these to explore the nonlinear response in daily GPP to these multiple predictors that we were seeing. And so HGAMs are useful tools, again, for these nonlinear relationships. It allows for predictors to be additive and accounts for structured data via grouping, like how our conceptual figure is kind of laid out. So we used HGAMs to test for the effects of climate index, which are the ONI and the monsoon, as a grouping variable for the predictors. Here, the discharge turbidity, and I included light in explaining GPP. And so I'm just going to kind of walk you through how we use the HGAMs as a way to do some hypothesis testing. This table compares different model structures of the HGAMs and then their AIC score for the spring and summer period. This top model, and this first row is this G model type. It's a very simple general response trend in GPP to predictors, or we in the HGAM world call this the global smoother. The model structure, as you move down the table, increases in complexity by incorporating climate index. So this bottom model structure was our best structure based on the lowest AIC for both spring and summer. And this model structure basically had a global trend as well as a random intercept and slope based on the climate index. And this just means that there's a general trend, but there's variability in the response of GPP from this general trend, and that can be explained by the climate index. So moving forward into the results, I use that model. But I'm going to talk, so my results are laid out where I talk about spring, the annual means and dailies, and then I'll go into the summer. So sorry, okay. I'll just walk you through these plots real fast. On the top, we have the top row on the x-axis is the ONI, and then moving from left to right, we have discharge, turbidity, and then GPP. I'm just looking for relationships using the linear regressions. And basically annual mean discharge tended to be higher when ONI was positive. Again, those El Nino conditions, but this was uncertain. And then looking at the bottom row with the connections between GPP and the disturbance, we have discharge moving from left to right, GPP versus discharge, and that tend to have the strongest relationship where higher snowmelt decreased GPP, and the relationships between GPP and turbidity were uncertain. Okay, so now we're going into the HGAMs. First, I just want to walk you through these figures that show this global response trend for GPP, and this is on the y-axis, and then the predictors are discharge, turbidity, and PAR moving from left to right. And so you can see these global effects show both elevated discharge and turbidity, lower GPP, while light or PAR tends to increase GPP. And now if you add these colorful plots, these show basically in a nutshell that there's variation in the response of GPP relative to this global trend. And so the 0 y-axis on these colored plots would mean that if the line followed the 0 axis, it means there'd be no difference from the global trend. And then these colors are this ONI grouping variable. And so just by looking at the wiggliness, there's some deviation going on. On the bottom in plot D and the bottom left, that's discharge. And so that suggests that the ONI grouping is important for capturing the response in GBP to discharge. And there is some variation, however, to a lesser extent for turbidity in the bottom middle and then light on the bottom right. Okay, now we're talking about the summer annual means with the linear regressions. You can see that the effect, these are kind of like the same plots, but the monsoon is on the x-axis for the top row. And you can see the effect of the monsoon was uncertain for turbidity, discharge, and GPP. The summer mean GPP was not clearly related to turbidity, and interestingly, turbidity was inversely related to discharge, and so that just kind of means that lower higher turbidity events can happen with lower discharge. And I guess overall, the finding of this analysis was that by using annual averages during this monsoon period, we can't really capture the influence of the abrupt, short-lived disturbance on primary production. So last results slide are the HGAMs again, daily means for the summertime. We have the global plots on the top. And again, we have discharge, turbidity, and light. And you can see, again, elevated discharge and turbidity, lower GBP, while light increases. And based on the effect size, we see that turbidity was the predominant disturbance variable looking at the global trends. And now if you add the colorful plots, we can see again some variation in how the response of GBP to these variables occurs, and that can be explained by the monsoon index. And so this supports our hypothesis that climate is linked with disturbance, and we just really need some sophisticated tools to to disentangle those relationships. All right, to summarize, disturbance variables as controls on GPP shifts between seasons. In snowmelt, during spring, we see snowmelt affecting GPP both at the annual and daily scale. In summer, we weren't really able to capture something significantly regarding, yeah, sorry, there was a noise on my computer. During summer, turbidity as a predominant driver didn't really appear until we looked at the daily scale. And I think the take home is that there's these emergent linkages between climate disturbance and GPP that are discovered through long-term data sets. Okay, and I'll just give you a little teaser slide. That another paper that I'm working on with some of the people online brings in a spatial component in addition to the temporal, where we have a site above Cochiti, we have the Bernalillo, and a site nestled in the city at the Rio Bravo Bridge. And we're, again, looking at metabolism, and we see that there's these windows of opportunity for primary production, and this varies across sites from summer to fall, and we attribute this timing to complex interactions in discharge, geomorphology, and substrate stability that Dave mentioned earlier. And yeah, so we're gonna identify these hot moments in time for basal food resources. And then another work from my postdoc is to look at river hydrodynamic controls on shaping spatial distribution of primary production. And the goal is to understand the drivers of these hot spots. Like you can see in this very green photo of lots of primary production during low flow conditions by the Rio Bravo Bridge. And then we want to know, like, how do these hot spots scale up to what we measure at the ecosystem level as GPP? And so we did a whole bunch of data collection one summer, which also included chlorophyll A, diatom community abundance, and identification. Shout out to Becky Bixby. And I just plugging in a nice map of what we're seeing for chlorophyll A with those larger spots on the map, meaning hotter productivity going on. So hopefully this will help bring in some new insights on food resource availability and quality, ultimately for the silvery minnow. And I will hand the talk back to Dave. Thanks for listening.
Okay, so I'm going to finish up with a section I'm calling Changing Disturbance Regimes in the Middle Rio Grande. And I'm going to race through this because I'd really like to leave a little bit of time for questions. So, yeah, so this is going to be kind of truncated, but my research questions here were, are there significant change points in this long-term data? How has water quality shifted? And if it has shifted, where are the changes coming from? And for this analysis, I'm using all 18 years of data. And I decided to do this analysis for this talk for two reasons. One, I wanted to show the utility of the full data set. And also, we've noticed in the last couple of years that it looks like the disturbance regime for water quality has shifted two different times. And so the first time it shifted was following 2011, following the Lost Conscious fire. And, we noticed, recorded, documented, and published all of these changes to water quality following that fire, these changes in dissolved oxygen and these spikes in specific conductance. And it was really obvious what was going on here. There was a massive fire on the landscape and water quality shifted. But interestingly, in the last 5 years, we've noticed that there's a similar shift occurring in extreme water quality events. However, there's no obvious source for this shift in water quality. And so what we've noticed since 2021 is we're seeing once again these deep sags in dissolved oxygen. So I'm showing you DO data on the top part of this graph. And we're seeing larger spikes in specific conductance that we've ever seen in the Middle Rio Grande. And so just to kind of put this another way, in 2011, the largest wildfire, the largest wildfire in New Mexico state history at the time, triggered a bunch of water quality impacts to the river. Now in 2021, we're seeing similar impacts, but there was no wildfire. There was nothing like that we know of that could have triggered these impacts, and yet we're seeing them. And so for this part of the talk, I really had three questions. One, I was curious, are these signals that we're seeing visually in the data actually representing statistically significant changes? If so, how has the water quality changed? So how have these episodic events or extreme events changed in both frequency and severity? And finally, where are these changes originating from, or where are these pulses originating from? When I first started working on this data set, and once again, this is very preliminary work, but I had these three kind of guesses or hypotheses about where these sources of water quality excursions might be coming from. The first was from these small tributaries that are draining the east side of the Jemez Mountains. Those tributaries are where the Los Conchas fire impacted the Middle Rio Grande through. So almost all of those events that I showed you in that first paper were from discharge events coming out of those small canyons. And then the other possibility would be that the Jemez River basin itself was contributing these pulses of extreme water quality. Although there's no obvious reason for that, other than maybe material that had gotten deposited in the system during active burns was now finally moving its way into the river. And then the third possibility was the Galisteo Basin. This basin has received a lot of salt cedar removal work in the last 4 or 5 years. And I thought it was possible that that salt cedar removal might be mobilizing salts and sediments. So those were my three kind of guesses about where this might be coming from. So to answer my first question, which was, are these signals that we're seeing visually in the data actually representing statistically significant change? To answer this question, I used a variety of change point detectors. The first one I used looked at changes in the mean, and that had no result. And the reason for that is pretty obvious. The mean isn't really shifting here, but what is shifting are the extreme tails of the data distribution. So I switched to a multinomial change point scanner, which looks for changes in extreme events or in the tails of data. And long story short, that multinomial change point scanner identified two shifts in the data. In the specific conductance data I'm showing here on the left, it identified a statistically significant shift in 2021. And in the DO data, and this is daily mean data, or I'm sorry, daily min data, that change point detector identified a statistically significant change in 2011 following the less conscious fire. So to answer the first question, yes, these visual changes that we're seeing are statistically significant and representative of something probably real. Next, I wanted to ask, how has the rate of change of these events changed over time? And I don't have time to go through all of this figure, but basically what you've got in the top is a peak over threshold analysis where I'm looking at all extreme events that exceeded a certain threshold. And these bar charts down here show you that if we compare the three different eras that we've separated the data into, which are pre-loss conscious, post-loss conscious, and post-2021, that the rate of extreme events for both specific conductance in the left and DO in the right have increased for each of those areas, and these are annual rates. And these are statistically significant. And then I created ranked exceedance curves for these data, which basically allow us to ask, is the severity of these extreme events changing? And once again, we're looking at data in the blue from the pre-loss conscious fire era, in the red from post-loss conscious, and in the green in post-2021. And these upward shifts in these curves tell you that the severity of these extreme events is increasing, and these are also statistically significant. So the next question was, where are these events coming from? And I looked at two different analyses or used two different ways of trying to get at this. And long story short, so that we have a few minutes for questions, it looks like these pulses are coming out of the Jemez River. They're not coming off of those ungauged tributaries on the east side of the Jemez. They're not coming out of the Galisteo Basin, but they're primarily coming out of the Jemez River watershed itself. And I'm going to skip to this slide, which is a precipitation analysis that I'm working on as well, that attempts to isolate where precipitation events are occurring in the watershed and how monsoon events in different parts of the watershed are linked to specific water quality excursion events. So with that, I'm just going to go ahead and click to the end here. And I think we'll just go ahead and take questions.
Thank you so much, Dave. Well, thanks. Really appreciate you. I have to go run and teach right now. So I will let you take questions, and thank you all again for coming, and let you guys all take it on from here. Thank you so much. Who wants to go first with the question?
Me.
Go ahead, Alex.
No, Deborah, go ahead. Oh no, I was just gonna like thanks for the great talk. I really like this type of long-term research, and I was kind of wondering, does the data, do you have to go to it and then collect the data, or is there like an Internet of Things type, remote data collection, and how does that work?
So I think what you're asking is, are these sites telemetered and is there a way to look at the data in real time
Yeah, or like remotely. Yeah.
remotely? So some of our sites, the sites I presented today are sort of a subset of a larger water quality network where we have, I think, a total of 16 or 17 sites spread out over southern Colorado and northern New Mexico. Some of those sites are telemetered, and so we can log into the sites remotely and collect data. But a lot of them are not for several reasons. One is it makes the sites much more susceptible to vandalism. We've had three of our $15,000 or $13,000 instruments stolen over the years, and so we try to keep a pretty low profile with our instruments. And also we don't have self-service at some of our locations. So but to answer your question, yes, some of our sites are telemetered, a lot are not.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Betsy and Dave. Such amazing work. I'm a big fan. And it's such a complex data set, so much work to get such cool results out of it. So I really appreciate it. You sharing some of it. I'm curious, Dave, about your, yeah, like intriguing patterns in these last few years. If you've looked at if there's maybe correlations with precipitation intensity. And I ask that because people throw around this hypothesis that maybe our monsoons are getting stronger, and maybe that could be interacting with materials in those watersheds to cause these excursions. Have you considered that or looked at it versus discharge or anything like that?
So that's a piece of this that I'm actively working on, Alex. An interesting and yeah, thanks for that question. An interesting thing to note here is these impacts showed up in 2021, and in 2020 we had a really dry year. And so it's possible that something about a very dry year followed by a pretty wet year might be causing these. But I don't have any direct evidence yet that this is related to increasing precip. Um, Hopefully, within the next couple of weeks, I'll actually be able to answer that question. It's a really good one.
I'll just say, like, there's just so much complexity happening within a watershed, and then you bring in, multiple years of data, and like, how do these antecedent conditions influence what you're seeing, like present day? Like, just a lot of things happening that adds to like the noise that we're seeing, and so we really need to figure out how to like untangle that and the right tools. I don't know what those are right now. Dave, sounds like Dave's like thinking way more on it than I am, but I just wanted to add that as you know, for some
Yeah.
perspective.
Thanks. And it does look like Colleen Cunningham has one question we might have time for.
Yeah.
Hi, sorry it took me a second to figure out how to unmute myself on Zoom. Um, I had a question about like um turbidity, sediment, and DO. What
Mhm.
sort of equipment or technology are you using for your DO measurements, and have you had issues with um like sediment impacting the measurements or the equipment? Is it membrane based or optical sensors?
So great question. When we started this work, there were no optical sensors. It was all membrane based. So the first several years of data are membrane based data. However, as soon as the optical sensors were made available, we started using the optical sensors. So that's what we use exclusively now. There doesn't seem to be an interaction with turbidity. YSI, or yeah, YSI to my knowledge doesn't, they don't report any sort of negative interactions with turbidity. They're yeah. So not that we know of. Um, Also, interestingly, in the 2011 data, we had both optical sensors and membrane-based sensors running at the same time, and they collected the same data. So it doesn't seem like either of those technologies, well, both of those technologies were giving us similar numbers.
Interesting. Thank you for that.
Sure. Anybody else?
There's
Hey,
just a little note from Grace Haggerty about salt cedar removal behind the dam. Is this, I'm guessing this, I know of the Galisteo Dam, but I'm not familiar with the Jemez. But we can also look into how the dam is being operated differently. I can ask the basin manager on that and just to gain a little more perspective on potential operational changes. Yeah.
Yeah, what was interesting was when we looked at storm events and discharge events that originated in the Galisteo almost exclusively, so they were relatively localized storm cells. We and then traced those to water quality events at our sensor downstream. We weren't seeing really big. Those were not the events that were causing these really significant increases in conductance or these sags in dissolved oxygen. And so, yeah, that was one of my original sort of thoughts, and I don't think it really pans out from the data. Although,
Yeah,
once again,
this is Grace. I was really talking about the humus dam because I do think there's been a lot of work by San Ana Pueblo back there, and not sure, but also maybe some sediment control or actually releases. Kind of they're operating that dam a little bit differently, but I do think there's probably some further upstream influences coming in to the Jemez too, like that big flooding event that they had in the Jemez. Probably, you probably saw that spike, I'm sure. I can't remember when that was, a year or two ago.
Grace, thanks so much for that context. Yeah, that's really interesting. What I'm hoping to do next is get water quality data from the Vice Caldera headquarters and see if we can isolate where some of these impacts are entering the river a little more quantitatively. And so that would help us start to get at that context that you just provided. So, but that's super helpful. Thank you.
hey, this is James Fluke. Can you hear me?
Yes. Hey,
Hey,
James.
good to see you. Good to see you, Dave and Betsy. Thanks for that presentation. Pretty interesting stuff you guys are doing. Um, I know it's not the focus of this work, but I thought it was interesting that you were talking about different signatures that you were seeing from the sediment sources um, that were washing in. And one thing that we're kind of interested in, we kind of think that some of these reaches are evacuating sediment, like um, there's a lot of sediment mobilizing from the banks and as a effective coachity, and we kind of think that that's has a variation going through this reach that you guys are looking at. I was curious, is there any way that you think your data could like confirm or dispel those uh, hypotheses?
Yeah, James, I think so. Well, first of all, good to hear from you, and it'd be great to sit down and talk about this in greater detail. Um, so I think we could look at periods where there were changes in discharge coming out of the dam, but where there weren't any pulses coming from any other watersheds. And we could look to see how the water quality responds to those just simply dam pulses. And that could give us an idea um, if there's something that's strictly related to releases from the dam. But we could like sit down together and talk about that in greater detail.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, interesting. Appreciate that, Dave.
Yeah. If folks have any other questions, feel free to email me. I'm happy to chat on the phone or exchange emails or exchange data. Yeah, excited to collaborate with folks.
Well, thank you guys so much for everything. We're a few minutes past, and yeah, we really appreciate your time and the extra questions, and we will make sure that this recording is available for everybody. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye. Thanks.